The FX CPUs are celebrating 10 years of existence in 2022, so with a lot of controversy behind them in the past decade, and across the board many people disliking the lineup, now seems like a great time to see if the piledriver CPUs have evolved over time or are they better left behind as a piece of history. So in today's review we have the FX 6300, AMD's mid-range competitor from 2012. Offering an alleged 6 cores and 6 threads, it might seem like it's fairly modern by today's standards, but that can't be further from the truth. What I mean by that, you will find out in the benchmarks. But first, a quick side note. As I'm using the RX 570 for testing, in order to avoid a GPU bottleneck and get the most out of the CPU, where necessary I will reduce settings or resolution. But believe me, even at higher resolutions, you won't be in for a nice experience. So without wasting any more time, let's start with the benchmarks. With the next-gen version of The Witcher 3 approaching its release date, it's nice to revisit the original and see how the FX 6300 handles the game. As you can see, I was using very low settings with the resolution set to 720p in order to get the CPU to work as much as possible. As you can see, the CPU handles the game quite nicely, but that was kind of expected, knowing that The Witcher 3 isn't really the most demanding game nowadays, although you can spot quite a few stutters here and there. So it's not really the smoothest experience overall. Speaking of smooth experiences, doesn't really seem that we'll be getting that many today, as the FX 6300 really struggles to run Kingdom Come Deliverance that well. In this game there was no need to turn down the resolution or settings. The CPU was bottlenecking the RX 570 so much, even at the high preset and 1080p resolution. This area of the game can be particularly stressful for a CPU, so no surprise that the FX 6300 underperforms here. But I was honestly disappointed. When using a stronger CPU, the RX 570 can easily handle the game and push 50 to 60 FPS at the same settings. So it's safe to say that the FX 6300 delivers terrible performance here. In the Mafia Remake, I used 720p with the high preset. But honestly, even at 1080p, the CPU really struggles in this game, especially when you enter quite busy areas of the map. So considering how the game is constructed, it happens quite a lot in the Mafia Remake. It's not as terrible as Kingdom Come Deliverance was, but honestly, I was expecting a bit more from the FX 6300. Seems like I have to turn down my expectations a bit. AC Valhalla is performing quite nicely on the FX 6300. That's a bit of a surprise, to be honest. I expected much worse performance, considering the results so far. Seems like this game can handle the architecture of the FX CPUs quite well. A game that doesn't really handle the architecture of the CPUs that well is Elden Ring, which performs kind of like Kingdom Come Deliverance, at the same settings and resolution, with heavy drops and the FPS mostly under 30. Nothing positive to say about the CPU in this game, it's just horrible performance across the board. With a stronger CPU, the RX 570 can handle the game quite easily at these settings, providing FPS around the 40s, sometimes going into the 50s, so it's safe to say that the CPU is the main problem here. Continuing our topic of terrible performance, in Dying Light 2 the CPU has quite a lot of problems as well, as it quite often happens that you experience frame drops and stutters when entering areas that aren't really loaded up by the CPU. Therefore, the game tends to freeze at the moment, which is also shown by the average figures, indicating quite a lot of stutters and once again, terrible performance by the CPU. As you can see, the Ubisoft titles tend to perform a little bit better on the FX CPU, but once again, the performance isn't really the greatest, with the benchmark having noticeable stutters from time to time, and an average FPS that seems good, until you look at the percentile figures. So as it stands, the Ubisoft games are taking the most advantage of the FX CPU architecture. But even that isn't enough to make the FX CPU appear as a viable option for modern gaming. You may be aware that the FX CPUs aren't really what they are supposed to be, with a lot of controversy behind the core count of the CPUs, and after a hefty lawsuit against AMD, you could claim $35 in return for false marketing by AMD. But honestly, no amount of money can justify such a bad performance by the FX series of CPUs. They were not so great back then, but they are certainly not better today. Might be that the higher-end FX 8000 series has much more to offer for modern gaming. But when it comes to the mid-range segment of FX CPUs, as you saw from the benchmarks, they are far from viable for a modern system, bottlenecking even an RX 570, which is far from a high-end GPU nowadays. In conclusion, the FX 6300 would be a nice CPU, but only if the second or third generation of Intel CPUs never existed. Speaking about second generation Intel CPUs, in my next video, the FX 6300 will go up against the i5 2500. This would be a pretty viable comparison back in the day, but seeing how the FX CPUs handles modern gaming, I don't really believe we are in for a nice experience, but we'll see. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you will tune in for the next video as well.